Scott Paul is at our desk. He serves as president of the Alliance for American Manufacturing. Joins us 10 days after GM announced it was cutting nearly 15,000 factory and white-collar jobs. I want to talk about that, but also want to talk about the news this week about the U.S.-China trade deal. So I know something you've been following closely in the wake of the back and forth, the off again, on again, and then the arrest yesterday of that key Chinese tech executive. What are the chances in your mind that this deal is actually going to come together?
That's a great question. We have about 20 years of built-up grievances with China that have extended over a couple of administrations. The latest rounds focused on intellectual property and the size of the trade deficit. It's hard to imagine solving all of those issues in 90 days when we haven't been able to do it over the course of 3 decades of a serious trade relationship with China. And so Ambassador Bob Lighthizer, who's our U.S. trade ambassador, who's been appointed to kind of head up these talks, really has his work cut out for him. And I think that, John, a couple things you mentioned, on top of this, you have the action where Canadian authorities extradited to the United States Sabrina Fang, the chief technology officer of Huawei, which is a key Chinese telecom company, but one that we have serious national security concerns around. That's really going to escalate the tensions a little bit. And you also have conflicting stories about what was actually agreed to. And there are entirely different versions coming out from China and from the U.S. government about what the path forward should be. I mean, I'd like to hope that we can make some progress. What I hope doesn't happen, though, is that we sign a piece of paper and say, well, we're going to revisit this in a couple of years, because we know what's happened when we've tried that, which is we haven't made any progress at all.
What's the role of the alliance in this? Are you talking to the White House about your concerns in the manufacturing sector in this country?
Yes, we're talking with the agencies, with the White House, about what some of our challenges are with respect to China. Some of them are related to steel, and that's being addressed separately through these Section 232 tariffs. Some of them directly relate to intellectual property. We know that there has been theft and trade secrets stolen. In fact, there was a Justice Department indictment handed down a few years ago in Western Pennsylvania related to Chinese military officers stealing trade secrets from a couple of our stakeholders. And so this is a key issue. We've lost billions upon billions of jobs. Billions upon billions of dollars in intellectual property. We've lost a couple million manufacturing jobs because of this imbalanced relationship and all of these trade barriers that we face.
For viewers who don't know, what is the alliance? Who are your stakeholders?
So we're a partnership between the United Steelworkers Union, which is America's largest industrial union, and several domestic manufacturers, mostly in the steel sector. But we look at the domestic operations of American manufacturing and how can we keep those competitive, and what role does policy play in keeping those competitive?
Well, speaking of the domestic side, we brought up the GM job layoffs that were announced last week, some 15,000 factory and white-collar jobs. You said after that announcement that if the president and Congress are serious about supporting factory workers, they'll quickly find a way to avert these devastating layoffs. How should the federal government go about averting layoffs from a company?
It's a great question, and so I think there's a couple of short-term things, there's longer-term things that are more challenging, but let's start with the short-term. Obviously, one of the things that I think worked reasonably well when we had the last downturn, and the auto sector was at the very forefront of that, were loans to retool and to produce vehicles that were in demand, and that certainly helped to bridge some of the difficulties that the auto industry was experiencing at the time. Let's keep in mind when people say, well, we don't want the government giving subsidies to companies. Everybody does it. Every country around the world is heavily invested in the success of their manufacturing industries. And we kind of stand alone as this kind of Adam Smith philosophy-driven nation. We're reluctant to do that on the federal level. On the state level, we do it all the time. You see with Foxconn and all of this in Wisconsin, but we're very reluctant to do this. And it actually does put our companies at a disadvantage.
Has it not worked out for us so far?
Has it not worked out? Well, no, we're losing market share. I mean, we still make and manufacture a lot of goods, but we are losing global market share. Our export performance is poor compared to where it was 2 or 3 decades ago. We have not grown our industry. We've lost more manufacturing jobs per capita than other industrialized nations. And so it's not just robots, it's not just technology. Part of it is policy, and part of it is, do we really have a manufacturing strategy? Rhetorical question, the answer to that is no, but we need one. Longer term, and I think this is just an important thing, but this is something that we're going to have to reckon with, is our companies are so driven by quarterly earnings that they lose sight of what makes them sustainable over the long run. And so, as you saw with GM, they announced 15,000 job cuts, their stock price goes up. And there's something very perverse about the incentives that are built into that system. And we have to, I'm not saying that we throw it out, but I think that there are ways to mitigate that. For instance, having worker representatives on corporate boards is something that's done in Germany and other countries. I think that could work well in the United States.
By the way, phone lines in this segment, if you want to join the conversation with Scott Paul of the Alliance for American Manufacturing, it's 202-748-8000. If you work in manufacturing, want to hear your stories, what you do, your concerns. All others can join at 202-748-8001. You can start calling in now. Mr. Paul, I do want to talk about a little bit more about the GM cuts. Yesterday, members of Congress from Ohio met with Mary Barra about those cuts, expressing their concerns. This was a video released by Sherrod Brown's office coming out of that meeting, him talking with Senator Rob Portman as well about what they asked of Mary Barra.
Spoke to President Trump today about this issue. He is very committed to helping us to keep this assembly plant in Ohio. We've also spoken to Secretary Costa as recently as today, the Labor Department, who is eager to try to be helpful. So we're trying everything we can to ensure that those workers at Lordstown get the support they deserve now to be able to build another product. We're not asking for charity. What we're asking for is to give the community and the workforce the opportunity to once again show what they can do.
Ms. Barra will tell you, and she's honest about that they are looking for ways to help these workers that have lost jobs to work at other GM plants around the country. That number is finite. Her work on it is ongoing, but people want to stay in the Valley and work in this plant. They've done it for almost 53 years. They're rated the best in the GM system, and Senator Portman and I are just going to continue to ask her to find a way, whether it's bringing some production to Mexico or whether it's building the electric vehicle there, building any one of the electric vehicles there. They know how to build cars. This community had a threat like this 10 years ago. They fought back. They did a similar to Drive It Home campaign that they're doing now. We stand with the community to get something in this plant and keep these hundreds and hundreds, well, thousands of GM workers working.
Scott Paul on the statements by the Ohio senators yesterday.
Well, I think that both Senator Portman and Senator Brown made very good points. And I think it's important to understand what would happen to Youngstown and to this community if the plant does go away. I mean, it's devastating. We've seen it show up in social indicators. And this is pretty grim, but deaths of despair, divorce rates, never recovering any sort of income. I mean, there's been lots of social science research about what happens when a plant closes, and so you want to try to avoid that at all costs. Now, will it be possible? And I think the answer is yes. The United Auto Workers, which represents the workers at Lordstown, I think will play a key role in determining the fate of this plant. And I think Senator Brown is right. There are a number of new platforms that General Motors is contemplating entering or is in the process of entering in electric vehicles, alternative fuel vehicles, autonomous vehicles. And the folks at Lordstown know how to make these. They know how to make them well, and they've adjusted. They've gone from one model to another and done it quite successfully, the company ought to be investing in them. And again, this goes back to shareholder returns. It seems like GM is putting the interests of its shareholders way far ahead of its stakeholders and its communities and its workers. And there has to be a little more balance to that.
That complex in Lordstown looking to lose something about 1,600 jobs. It was a plant that opened in 1966. Those stats from the Transport Topic story about the job losses throughout GM that were announced last week. We'll start in Ohio for you. Tom's up first from Findlay, Ohio. Good morning.
Yes, sir. Good morning.
Go ahead, Tom. You're on with Scott Paul.
C-SPAN. Well, my comment would be, this is a shout-out to Sherrod Brown. I'm a Whirlpool retiree living in Findlay. We build dishwashers here. Sherrod Brown was at the forefront of addressing the issue of imports, washers and dryers being brought into the United States and sold on fairly cheaper than we could manufacture them. So I want to give a shout-out to him for that. But also, I was wondering, this is a second question, if an American company takes a product line to China or Mexico to manufacture it, and example would be Hershey, who bought York peppermint patties and then moved that operation to Mexico. Oreo cookies are now made in Mexico. I'm wondering if there could be any kind of a tariff put on that product coming back into the U.S. to stop these manufacturers from taking these trusted brand names overseas. And
Scott Paul.
That is a great question by Tom in Ohio, and I own a Whirlpool dishwasher made in America, and it's high quality. So thank you for all your work in making those. So we don't have any sort of tariff policy now where if a product was made once made in the United States but is coming from overseas, that it would be taxed. The president has tweeted about that a lot. He's tweeted about it a lot, but we don't have a policy about it yet. I mean, one of the things that Senator Brown and others support is a change in tax law that would not allow companies to write off the expenses of essentially moving operations overseas, that would impose some penalty on them as well. And there are a number of Democrats who've been pushing this legislation. I wouldn't be surprised to see this show up in the new Congress. Obviously, in the Senate, it would be hard to get it passed given the makeup there. But in the House of Representatives, this is certainly something to keep an eye on.
To Independence, Oregon, Dan, good morning.
Hello. I'd like to ask about all the promises that manufacturing and government has made to us through the years from the 1970s on. Like if we decrease the population because we don't want to get 1 billion people here, or we're going to get computers and robots, but you're going to only be working a three-day job and you're going to be making more money. I remember all these things. I'm 65. What the heck happened? I'd really like to know.
Dan's making, I think, a good point, which is there's been a lot of alarmism and misperceptions about the future of manufacturing for the past couple of decades. And one of them is that robots would eat all the jobs, and that's been around. In fact, you can find it in the literature from the 50s and the 60s that was the future of manufacturing. And certainly you've seen some technologies that have changed the nature of work. But we invent new products, we increase our market share, we increase our output. There's other ways to mitigate that. Some countries, and I think this is an important thing, are looking at the next wave of technology and saying, well, this is going to be different. And I think the truth is no one really knows at this point what it's going to be like for manufacturing workers. But we should have economic policies that are much more flexible and nimble, particularly the kind of safety net that we provide to workers that are displaced, the type of either upskilling on the job or career and technical education that we're providing in addition to four-year college degrees. And I think all of that is really important in positioning us for the future. But I will add that there's no substitute for a competitiveness policy, because our manufacturing competes more than any other sector, except for perhaps agriculture, for market share around the world. And so this is something where I think the president is right to be renegotiating agreements, to taking a tougher line with China. I may disagree on some of the tactics here and there. I agree with others, but we have to get in there because we have been losing that market share because of this kind of hands-off policy that we've
2
had.
years into his presidency, would you say at this point that the president's trade actions, trade wars, are bringing manufacturing jobs back to the United States?
I don't know if the trade actions are, but there are a lot of manufacturing jobs that have been added. We're in a good period of manufacturing job growth, and we've seen steady manufacturing job growth since 2010. This is important because there are a lot of people who said, well, manufacturing jobs just aren't coming back. Let's focus on something else. Let's focus on services. We'll all be computer programmers, and we'll take that additional day off, as the caller suggested. But the truth is, we have seen kind of the longest, steadiest period of manufacturing job growth in this country since the 1960s. And so that's pretty remarkable to think in the 21st century that it's possible. Part of it is because we've been developing energy and we have manufacturing processes around that. Part of that has been because we've been a little more competitive. And so I do think in the steel sector in particular, you've seen new investment in steel facilities and aluminum facilities in at least a dozen states since the steel tariffs were announced. And so that is having some impact on that sector.
James works in manufacturing, Toms River, New Jersey. Good morning.
Good morning, John. Good morning, Scott.
Good morning.
I'd just like to bring up some facts here about we have an a representative government where we vote. As a citizen, I vote for the House of Representatives, I vote for a senator, and I vote for the president. What I don't seem to understand is Ross Perot debated Bill Clinton about NAFTA and on Larry King Live, and he said that if they pass NAFTA, the companies are going to leave here in waves. And that's just what happened. We had, out of over 400 House of Representatives and 50 senators, five of them voted against it. Barry Sanders was one of them. I'm not sure about Elizabeth Warren. I don't know if she was in office or not. But if she was, I know she voted against it. So if they're supposed to represent our best interests, this doesn't make any sense. They cut the American worker, the working man's throat. They let these companies go overseas. So why did they pass NAFTA? Ross Perot told the truth. Bill Clinton lied. This was George Bush the father's idea. Hillary and Bill Clinton picked up on it. They loved it, and he pushed for it, and they got it through, and look what happened. Now,
Scott Paul.
Yeah, so James is talking about NAFTA, which is also quite timely because we have the NAFTA 2.0 or the USMCA. And let's rewind 25 years ago very quickly, because the idea of a free trade agreement with a country like Mexico was a grand experiment. We had never done that before. And I think it's fair to say that experiment fell short. I mean, there were a number of workers who were displaced. The bigger impact, perhaps, was the depressed manufacturing wages in the United States because of the very low manufacturing wages in Mexico. And so the question for me now, and I'm glad James mentioned some of the Democrats here, because there were about 100 Democrats who supported the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1993 when it passed, and President Clinton was the president, is that they're going to play a very key role in what happens next. And the choices are still unclear, but one of the choices may be the president signals that he's going to withdraw from the existing NAFTA, which would probably cause some market disruption, I think, and really put the pressure on Congress to pass this USMCA. A lot of Democrats are looking at the new agreement with Mexico and saying, is it strong enough on workers' rights? Is it going to prevent the type of outsourcing that we're seeing GM do with the Chevy Blazer moving to Mexico? And I still think those are unanswered questions. And so some of the politicians that James was talking about, they're going to play a very key role in the fate of this moving ahead.
What is the alliance telling politicians? Should they vote for it?
Well, we're saying we need more information. right now, because, and I've been around these trade deals long enough to know that the agreement is one thing. What actually is presented to the Congress is an additional thing. And so we've been counseling the Congress to look very closely at the automotive rules of origin. That's basically, if you want tariff-free treatment to sell an automobile in North America, it has to be virtually all made in North America. It can't come with parts from a lot of parts from outside of the region. And also to look at the wage requirements within the auto industry as well, and look to see if the Mexican labor law changes are really going to bring up wages in Mexico. All of that would make a difference. I think those are still really unanswered questions. And I think Democrats should also push for some investments in things that would help workers in the United States very directly as well, like infrastructure or workforce training. So that's what we're saying.
To Illinois, Donald's waiting, works in manufacturing. Donald, what kind of work do you do?
No, I'm retired. I'm a retired worker. Used to live in Flint, Michigan, and I've seen the devastation of General Motors leaving the community. And my question is, Reagan and Bush destroyed the middle class with destroying the unions and creating NAFTA. So the last guy stole my thunder, and I agree 100% with the last gentleman just said. But work companies need to realize if you employ an American citizen and pay him a good wage, guess what? He pays taxes. He buys products. He buys new cars. So, both sides, Democrats and Republicans, got to stop screwing the American people. It's just a shame. God bless America and have a great day.
Mr. Paul?
Well, it's clear, and I'm glad that Donald mentioned this, and Flint suffered unbelievable job loss that had lasting impacts in the community decades later. Manufacturing workers have borne a disproportionate share of the economic pain in the United States over the last several decades. Trade policy is one reason. I think skewing the balance between kind of capital and labor has made a big difference as well. And again, the fact that we almost uniquely among industrialized democracies have a terrible safety net for people who lose their jobs or who are in transition. We lost 1 out of every 3 manufacturing jobs in the first decade of this century, from 2000 to 2009. That's almost unimaginable. That kind of devastation. It was even worse than it was during the Great Depression for manufacturing. And so, I think the question is that the fate that we're resigned to, or can we have a different future? And President Trump evokes this nostalgia. He's like, I'm going to bring back these jobs in steel and coal and all of this. And I'm a manufacturing booster, and I don't think that's entirely possible to bring back the manufacturing sector like it was in the 1950s or 1960s. But that doesn't mean that we can't have a 21st century manufacturing sector where we're the world's leaders in not only inventing things like the iPhone, but also making it here, or autonomous vehicles, or other things with respect to clean energy, and that we should be on the cutting edge of that. And public policy plays a key role, and that's one of the messages that we deliver to the Congress.
Richard is waiting in Brooklyn. Good morning.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. I think Trump's policy in some aspects could help us and make our economy better. But in foreign policy, I saw that some politician activities like Saad al-Faqih in London don't like Trump foreign policy because he just want to support Saudi Arabia for making our economy better. What's your idea about it? It's true to ignore all of their crime for making our economy better or not? Thank you.
That's Richard in Brooklyn. We only have about a minute left. Want to get in Lawrence in Washington, D.C. Lawrence, go ahead.
I'm on.
Go ahead, Lawrence.
Good morning, sir. I have a question that's more on the political dealing with this issue, and that is, what role does Mitch McConnell relationship, his wife, who is, I believe, in that Trump, the Trump administration? I would just like to know, because Mitch McConnell has this tendencies behind the scenes working things, and we never hear about it. But I'm of a belief that he has his hand in this, and somewhere along the line, because I do know, I think I know, that his wife is of Chinese origin. And the first thing he did when he got in the presidency, he held that first meeting in Florida with the Chinese diplomats.
Lawrence, got your point on Mitch McConnell.
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of, there are a number of senators and members of Congress who have been wrong on China policy for a long time. I will candidly say I don't think that the origin of their spouses or families probably has a lot to do with it. I can think of also examples of folks of Chinese descent who push back a lot against Beijing as well. But there is an important point here, which is I think that we've seen a change in the Congress, and perhaps the president has driven a little bit of that, where you have some senators who had been kind of totally free trade with China, like Marco Rubio, who are now saying, well, let's take another look at this. This is having devastating impacts on the United States. And so that's an area where I do think that you might see House Democrats, Senate Republicans, and the administration be able to work together as we look ahead.
Scott Paul is president of the Alliance for American Manufacturing. You can check them out online at americanmanufacturing.org. Always appreciate your time.
Thanks, John.